The rain poured heavily over the city streets, drumming against the rooftops and flooding the sidewalks. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows on the pavement where a young man stood, drenched from head to toe. His designer sneakers, once pristine white, were now soaked and stained with mud. His expensive leather jacket clung to his body, doing little to shield him from the cold. For the first time in his life, he felt helpless. Jason Carter had never known struggle. Born into a life of unimaginable wealth, he was the only son of Richard Carter, a self-made millionaire who had built an empire from the ground up. Jason grew up in luxury, private jets, 5-star vacations, and a bank account that never saw a limit. He had never needed to work a day in his life, never needed to worry about bills, food, or survival. Everything had always been handed to him on a silver platter. But with that privilege came arrogance. Jason had become spoiled, reckless, and entitled, treating people as if they were beneath him. His father had spent years watching him throw away opportunities, get into trouble, and waste money as if it were endless. But the final straw came when Jason crashed a brand new sports car in a drunken joyride, laughing as if nothing had happened. The news headlines had humiliated Richard, and he knew he couldn't let his son continue down this path. That's when he made the decision. Jason needed to learn a lesson, a real one. And so, with nothing but a few $100s, a basic apartment, and a warning not to come crawling back, Jason was sent away to the projects. Now, standing under the relentless rain in a neighborhood he never would have dared step foot in before, Jason felt something unfamiliar: fear. The buildings around him were nothing like the grand estates he was used to. The streets smelled of damp, concrete, and cheap takeout, the air thick with the sounds of car horns, distant shouting, and a life he had never imagined for himself. He clenched his fists, frustration bubbling inside him. How could his father do this to him? This wasn't a punishment. It was a death sentence. His stomach growled. He hadn't eaten all day, and for the first time, there was no chef to prepare a gourmet meal, no credit card to order whatever he wanted. He would have to figure it out himself. Jason hesitantly walked towards a small convenience store at the corner, its flickering neon sign barely lighting up the broken sidewalk. As he stepped inside, the warmth of the store offered a brief escape from the cold, but all eyes turned to him. His expensive clothes, even in their ruined state, screamed that he didn't belong here. He could feel the stares, the silent judgment. Ignoring them, he picked up a sandwich from the fridge, his fingers shaking slightly as he reached for his wallet. He had the cash his father gave him, but for the first time, he realized it was limited. Every dollar now mattered. As he placed the sandwich on the counter, the cashier, a woman in her late 20s with tired eyes and a no-nonsense expression, rang up his total. "That'll be $5, she said flatly. Jason pulled out a crisp bill and handed it to her, but as she took it, their eyes met for a brief moment. Her gaze wasn't filled with admiration, envy, or fake politeness like the people he was used to. It was something else, something unreadable. And for a reason he couldn't explain, it unsettled him. He grabbed his sandwich and walked out without another word, stepping back into the rain. But he couldn't shake the feeling that somehow this woman had seen right through him. What Jason didn't know was that this moment, this small, insignificant exchange, was only the beginning, because soon he would learn that survival wasn't just about money. It was about the people you met along the way, and one of them was about to change his life forever. Jason sat on the worn-out couch in his tiny, one-bedroom apartment, the flickering light above him barely illuminating the peeling wallpaper. He could still hear the distant sirens and occasional shouts from the street below, The smell of cheap instant noodles filled the room. His dinner for the night. He never imagined living like this. Just a few days ago, he was in a penthouse with a skyline view, where he could order anything with a single call. Now he was counting dollars, making sure he had enough for the rest of the week. His father had stripped everything away. His credit cards, his connections, his comfortable life. And the worst part? No one cared who he was here. Days passed, and Jason quickly realized that survival wasn't just about money. It was about knowing how to move, who to trust, and how to stay out of trouble. He wasn't used to this world. Here, people didn't pretend to be nice because of wealth. Here, respect had to be earned. He kept his head down, trying not to attract attention. But it was impossible. He stood out even if he didn't want to. Some people looked at him with curiosity, others with suspicion, and then there were those who saw him as an easy target. One evening, as he walked back from the store, carrying a bag of cheap groceries, he felt someone watching him. The streets were dimly lit, and a group of guys stood near the alley, their eyes locked on him. Jason's heart pounded. He wasn't stupid. He knew what was coming. He quickened his pace, but before he could react, one of them stepped in front of him. "Yo, new guy," the man said, smirking. "What you got in the bag?" Jason clenched his jaw. "Just food." Another guy chuckled. "Let's see it." Jason wanted to fight back, to stand his ground, but he wasn't built for this. He had never fought a day in his life, never had to defend himself. Before he could process, a hard shove sent him stumbling back, his bag ripped from his hands. His groceries spilled onto the sidewalk. Laughter filled the air. "Welcome to the neighborhood," one of them said before they walked off. Jason stood there, fists clenched, his pride shattered. His body shook, not just from anger, but from something deeper, fear, helplessness. He was nothing here. That night, as he sat on the couch staring at the empty walls, he realized something painful. Money had protected him all his life, but now, without it, he was no one. The next morning, Jason returned to the same convenience store. The cashier from before, the woman with the piercing gaze, was behind the counter again. "You look like you had a rough night," she said, eyeing the bruise on his arm. Jason exhaled sharply, grabbing a bottle of water. "Yeah, something like that." She studied him for a moment before ringing him up. "You should be careful around here. People can tell when you don't belong." Jason hesitated. "What's your name?" She raised an eyebrow as if debating whether to answer. "Mia." There was something different about her. She wasn't like the girls he knew. She wasn't impressed by money, looks, or charm. She seemed strong, independent. He found himself wanting to know more. But before he could ask, she slid his change across the counter and looked past him, signaling their conversation was over. Over the next few weeks, Jason learned to navigate his new life. He found work at a local diner, washing dishes for the first time in his life. The job was exhausting, but it kept him going. He kept running into Mia at the store, their conversations growing slightly longer each time. She was guarded, but he could tell there was more to her story. One night, as he walked home from work, he spotted Mia outside the store, arguing with a man who looked twice her size. Jason stopped, his instincts telling him to walk away, but something held him back. "Everything okay?" he asked, stepping closer. Mia's eyes flicked to him, a mixture of frustration and warning. The man turned, eyeing Jason up and down. "Who's this?" The man sneered. "No one," Mia said quickly. "Just go." But the man didn't move. Jason could feel the tension thicken the air. His heart pounded. He wasn't a fighter, but he couldn't just stand there. "Maybe you should listen to her," Jason said, his voice steady. despite the fear crawling up his spine. The man let out a cold laugh before stepping closer. "You think you can tell me what to do?" Jason swallowed hard. He knew he was outmatched, but before things could escalate, Mia stepped between them. "Leave Dwayne. Now." Her voice was sharp, commanding. For a moment, Jason thought the man might ignore her, but after a long, tense stare, Dwayne scoffed and walked off, muttering under his breath. Mia let out a slow breath, rubbing her temples. "Who was that?" Jason asked. She shook her head. "No one you want to mess with." Jason could see the stress in her eyes, the weight she carried. He wanted to ask more, but he knew better than to push. As the days passed, Jason and Mia kept crossing paths. Slowly, her walls began to crack, and he started to see glimpses of the person behind the tough exterior. She had grown up here, raised by a single mother who worked multiple jobs to keep them afloat. She had dreams once, college, a better life, but reality had forced her to stay. Jason found himself drawn to her in a way he couldn't explain. She wasn't like anyone he had ever met. She was real, strong, and unapologetic. But just as things started to shift between them, Jason's past came crashing back. One evening, as he walked out of the diner, he saw a sleek black car parked. Across the street, the door opened, and a man in a sharp suit stepped out. "Jason Carter," the man said smoothly. Jason's stomach dropped. His father had sent someone. The man smirked. "Time's up. Your father wants you back." Jason stood frozen, his heart pounding. He had thought he wanted this, to go home, to escape this life. But now, he wasn't so sure. Jason's pulse quickened as he stared at the man standing before him. The polished black car, the tailored suit, the confident smirk. Everything about him screamed wealth and power. He had seen this before, back in his old life. His father had sent people like this whenever he needed things handled. "You have two options," the man continued, his voice smooth but firm. "Come back with me now, or make this harder than it needs to be." Jason felt the weight of his father's decision pressing down on him. This was what he had wanted for weeks. A way out, a return to comfort, to security. No more struggling for rent, no more cheap food, no more fear of what the next day would bring. And yet, as he stood there, he hesitated. Mia's voice echoed in his mind, the way she had spoken about her life, her struggles, her dreams that never had the chance to grow. He thought about the diner, the long hours, the exhaustion, but also the satisfaction of earning something on his own. He thought about the people he had met, the lessons he had learned, the way he had changed, and most of all, he thought about her. Jason clenched his fists. "Tell my father I'm not coming back," he said, his voice steady. The man's smirk faded slightly. "You sure about that?" Jason nodded. "Yeah, I am." The man exhaled sharply, as if annoyed, then glanced at his watch. "Your father won't be happy." Jason shrugged. That's his problem. With a final glance, the man turned and got back into the car, slamming the door behind him. Jason watched as the car disappeared down the street, a strange mix of fear and relief washing over him. He had just walked away from everything: money, security, the life he had always known, and yet, for the first time, he felt free. Later that night, Jason found himself outside Mia's apartment. He hesitated before knocking, wondering if he was making a mistake. But before he could turn away, the door opened. Mia looked at him, her eyes searching his. "You okay?" Jason nodded, then exhaled a small laugh. "I think I just walked away from everything." Mia leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "And how do you feel about that?" Jason thought for a moment before answering. "Terrified, but also, right, A small smile tugged at Mia's lips. Welcome to the real world. They stood there in silence for a while, the city buzzing around them. Jason finally spoke. I don't know what happens next. I don't have a plan. Mia tilted her head slightly. Maybe you don't need one yet. And for once in his life, Jason was okay with that. Because sometimes, losing everything is the only way to find what truly matters.